We're going to go ahead and get started if you want to grab your seats. Okay, our next presentation is on child victims of human trafficking. And I want to start with the disclaimer that I really probably should have put sex trafficking because that's going to be my focus for this presentation. I know this morning I talked a little bit about both labor trafficking and sex trafficking, but this afternoon my focus really is on child victims of sex trafficking, since that's primarily been our clinic's focus so far, and that's been the focus of my research in this area. So I just want to make that disclaimer in case, so I don't want to make it seem like there are not also child victims of labor trafficking, because certainly there are. I just don't have the time to cover that today. So with respect to just here domestically in the United States, I talked about the fact that overall the figures vary, but it's somewhere between 21 and 27 million slaves worldwide. Here in the United States, just with respect to children, the figures are that it's about 325,000 children are at risk of sexual exploitation every year. So that's just an annual figure. The most vulnerable populations that we talk about, those of us that work in the field, and again, this is not exclusive, these are just the most vulnerable, tend to be runaways, foster youth, and then those that are juvenile offenders, so those that are brought in on for some type of arrest. It doesn't necessarily have to be prostitution, it can be something else, and then are in the juvenile detention center. It can be a real breeding ground for getting them into the trafficking. Some minor sex trafficking statistics, some of you might be familiar with these, you may not. In the United States, a runaway is expected to be approached within the first 48 hours to go into the sex trafficking trade. So very little time to get to them and get them back home safely before they're going to be approached by a pimp or a trafficker. 1 out of every 6 runaways is expected to be statistically engaged in sex trafficking. That went up just since last year, according to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Youth. Last year they said it was 1 in 7. This year they're up to 1 in 6. For here in Ohio with our children, we estimate the Ohio Attorney General, when they do their yearly statistics, 1,000 to 3,000 children of our own children here in Ohio are at risk every year for being trafficked. Again, this is for sex trafficking. According to the FBI, and this was in a hearing before the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security, the FBI said this is the most overlooked and under-investigated form of child sexual abuse facing American society today. So I say that just to stress again that it's very hard to get hard and fast figures here because, as you can imagine, it is very underreported, this type of sexual abuse, just like other types of sexual abuse, but this tends to be very overlooked because of the way that it's conducted. Does this happen here? Some of you probably saw just a couple days ago that there was a news story on Channel 5 where a 17-year-old girl was kidnapped on the Rapid. Remember, we said kidnap doesn't happen too often, but it happened just a couple days ago. She was kidnapped on the Rapid on Monday night, and this man took her to a homeless shelter, tried to sell her for sex, and then was trying to pump ecstasy into her, took her to some restaurant, and then she was eventually rescued by a restaurant worker who saw her and just got from her facial motions that she needed help and called 911. But what really stuck out to me in the news report was that she said, she was interviewed, her name was Javier Caldwell, was a 17-year-old girl. She said, "I tried to get help the entire night, no one paid attention." And I think that's kind of a ringing kind of theme that we all should hear, is that we need to pay attention when we see those kind of signs, because she clearly was trying to throw them out, and finally this one person saw and paid attention. The gentleman that you saw before, in this picture is Carlos Brown. And as it turned out, he has multiple convictions as a sex offender. So luckily, the good news is that he was picked up as a result of this and is now back in jail. So, moving forward, so dealing with child victim survivors, remember I told you earlier, we prefer to talk about them as survivors, but under the law, it's very important to categorize them as victims because then they are afforded special rights and privileges. With children, 34 states in the United States have passed safe harbor laws that afford special rights and opportunities for children dealing with human trafficking. Ohio really stood out in the beginning because we were among the first 10. So it was good that we kind of outpaced other states in the beginning. That was in 2012. So as you can see, a lot of states have quickly leapt in the fray to keep up with us. One of the big things that our safe harbor statute does is sets up a diversion program, and we kind of mentioned this earlier. What this does is if a child, a young girl or a young boy, is arrested for some type of prostitution offense, so that can be soliciting, loitering, or prostitution. Those are our 3 prostitution offenses that we have under the Ohio Revised Code. Or if number 2, they're arrested for some other type of offense, so it might be truancy, it might be some type of like avoiding whatever the evading arrest, resisting arrest, other type of like offenses. And the court has reason to believe that the child is a victim of trafficking based on the signs that they see. The child has the right to, instead of being prosecuted, be diverted, have their charges be diverted and held in abeyance while they take advantage of some of the services available, like sexual abuse counseling, like housing. We talked about this a little bit earlier. What housing is available to them is often an issue. Substance abuse counseling, if that's necessary, whatever diversionary programs are available. And I talked to you earlier on the adult side, and it's the same thing on the child side, that this seems to be a real step forward for us, because instead of treating children like criminals, we're treating them like victims. But a real focus for me right now in my practice and in what we're looking at is there even such a thing as a child prostitute? So as you saw right here, one of the things that the children can be brought in on is prostitution. They can be arrested for prostitution. And you heard Karen say earlier, we are moving so far as a country, and there's no such thing as a child prostitute. So that's really my question to you, is there such a thing as a child prostitute? And there's not really a clear-cut answer to that, unfortunately. Under federal law, absolutely not. There is no such thing as a child prostitute. So federal law came out under the Victims Protection Act that I talked to you about earlier this morning, and says that under the definition of trafficking, the person is guilty of trafficking if they have sex with someone by fraud, force, or coercion, or if they have sex with someone that has not attained 18 years of age. So in other words, if I have sex with someone that's under 18, you don't have to prove fraud, force, or coercion. That is automatically trafficking. So that person is automatically a trafficking victim. You don't have to prove all of those other elements in order to prove trafficking under federal law. Under Ohio, yeah, you can be charged with prostitution, and they still are charged with prostitution. And Christy's shaking her head at me because we have a case. She knows I just wrote an amicus brief in the juvenile court for a 17-year-old who was charged with prostitution. So I have a case pending right now where we are moving to dismiss those charges because we have our prostitution statute that just says no person shall engage in sexual activity for hire. If you do, you're guilty of a misdemeanor. It puts no age limitation on that. And our trafficking statutes put no age limitation on saying that if you're under 18, you don't have to prove compulsion.
I thought there was a limit of 16 on it where you didn't have to prove it.
I'll talk about that in a minute. So some states have done like a half measure where they have said, look, it's not prostitution if the person has reached 16 of age or older, and I'll talk about this especially as I move along, where they're kind of will come a little bit and say if they've reached usually what in that state is the age of consent for statutory rape purposes. So remember, statutory rape is if the girl or boy has had sex with someone usually that has to be a couple years older, that person is not guilty of statutory rape if that child has reached the age of consent. Some states it's as young as 14. Most states it's usually around 16, and here in Ohio we're at 16 for statutory consent. So you can, if you're 16, you can consent to that. So arrest statistics as a result of this is that the year that I could get the most, because there's a lot thrown around here, so that I could get the most actual accurate statistics is that in the year 2010, there were over 1,000 arrests of minors in the United States on just prostitution offenses. So where does this leave us? First of all, there's a real preemption issue. So a lot of you here are lawyers, some of you are not. So just real quickly, preemption means that when you have a federal law, like for instance here, that says this child is a victim for this exact same act, which is that she or he slept with someone that was an adult for money, and therefore this child is a victim of human trafficking. And then you have a state law that says this child is a criminal for the exact same act that he or she is a victim for sleeping with an adult for money. So it's very difficult to say that that doesn't frustrate the purpose of the federal law to say that now she's a criminal when for that same act under federal law, she's a victim. So that's certainly a key argument that we make to try to get these cases dismissed. We also argue, which addresses, is it Michelle? Okay, Michelle's point, that it conflicts with a lot of advances that we've made in Ohio state law, including, there's many statutes, including, for instance, compelling prostitution, where we've now delineated and given extra protection to children and really penalized more for trafficking in children. So for compelling prostitution, for instance, it says that no person can knowingly compel, induce, procure, etc., a minor to engage in sexual activity for hire, whether or not you knew the age of the minor, or if you believed it to be a minor. So this goes to the stings, when the police set up a sting, especially on the internet. So if you believe that it's a 17-year-old girl, or you believe that it's a 15-year-old girl, and it's really not. Or pay or agree for sex with a minor, whether or not you know the age of the minor. And if it's a 16 to 18-year-old victim, it's now a felony of the second degree. So as, again, those of you who are lawyers know that's a pretty high crime. If it's under 16, if the victim is under 16, it's a felony of the first degree. And that's really high. That's the same as a rape or voluntary manslaughter. So again, the legislature has gone back in and said, look, if you're going to compel prostitution with a child, with someone who's under 18, you're going to pay a much heavier fine now. Prosecuting traffickers. So this goes to Michelle's point. So now they have delineated for what you have to prove for prosecuting traffickers and trafficking. If the person is trafficking and the child is under 16, so prohibited from luring, enticing, etc. If the child is less than 16 or is a developmentally disabled person, and the person knows that they're either going to do involuntary servitude, so again, that labor trafficking, or they're going to be used for sexual activity, it eliminates that need for compulsion. So what this means is for trafficking purposes, if you have a girl that comes in that is 13, 14, 15, Under our trafficking statute, she is automatically a victim because you don't need to prove compulsion. So that's good for the 13, 14, 15-year-old girls. They really shouldn't be charged with prostitution-related offenses. Here's where it gets tricky, though. For 16 or 17-year-old girls, it says that you're prohibited from luring, enticing, etc. If you know the person will be subjected to involuntary servitude, etc., same thing, and you have a special relationship with them. So if you're a parent, teacher, coach, cleric, peace officer, it eliminates that compulsion, but not in other circumstances. So for instance, in the circumstance I have, this girl was pimped out by just some guy that was feeding her drugs. So I can't make the argument that she's automatically a victim that there's no reason to show compulsion under the trafficking statute. And when I try to make the argument to the prosecutor that you can't charge her with prostitution, she's a child, he says, show me where in the prostitution statute it says that she's immune from liability. So that's kind of where the quandary comes under a lot of state laws. So very few states have followed the federal lead in saying that any child under 18 is immune from liability. A lot of states have done more like what we have done, which essentially have left it open for prosecutors to charge certainly at least 16 and 17-year-old girls or boys with prostitution. Prosecuting Johns, another thing that I argue that this conflicts with. We've also raised the level for prosecuting Johns. So if a John, like we talked about before, and you heard this, right, that the police officers generally, why am I going to pick up a John because it's just a misdemeanor, it's the lowest misdemeanor, just throw, what am I going to get for this? Now, under the new safe harbor and end demand laws that have come out in Ohio, they have raised the penalty for Johns when they get involved with youth. So if they solicit a person who is 16 or 17, and they either know that the person is 16 or 17, or they can prove that they had reckless disregard for that, meaning that you can try to come forward with evidence, oh, I thought she was 20, or I thought she was 18, and then the judge can decide, okay, did you really think that based on the evidence that you're providing me? If the judge decides, look, you were reckless in making this decision that she was 18 or 19, the judge will say that's a felony. It's now a felony for you to sleep with a 16 or 17-year-old girl. Now, for 15 and below, so anyone who's under 16, whether or not the offender knows the age, it's a third-degree felony. So that's huge for those younger victims. The judge is going to say, I don't want to hear your evidence. Don't come in here telling me I thought this 15-year-old girl was 18, because doesn't matter. Under the statute, this is automatically a felony of the third degree. You're not allowed to present evidence saying, I thought she was 18, I thought she was 19. Tough. You slept with a 15-year-old girl, it's a third degree felony. So really raised the stakes for Johns who are sleeping with kids. So again, but also really conflicts with the fact that we still feel comfortable prosecuting kids for prostitution-related offenses. So why do at least I argue that this is a real problem, treating kids like criminals, is if you look at, I think probably a lot of us intuitively feel this way, but certainly if you look at the studies as well, kids are the most vulnerable of sex trafficking victims, as you can imagine. They're incapable of making any type of rational or informed choice to engage in commercial sex acts. So even if they aren't necessarily being pimped out, which they normally are, they're incapable of making this type of act. So when you look at the studies, their needs are generally really basic, the most basic. And go back to what I talked to you about before, which is that the three areas that most of these kids come from, and it often overlaps, but are the runaway youth, the foster care youth and the juvenile detention youth. And what I mean by overlap is that you will often have a child who runs away, then gets arrested, goes into juvenile detention, gets placed in foster care, and then runs away. So I don't mean to say that any of those are mutually exclusive, because they certainly are not. But you probably see from all of those populations that to a certain extent, a lot of those kids have come out of a situation that probably isn't so great. And that's a big thing that I kind of feel when I feel kind of called to serve in this area, is that most of these kids have probably had someone fail them at some point before they ended up on the streets, before they ended up in juvenile detention or in foster care. So their vulnerability often is just a need for those basic things like food and shelter. You heard Brian Vigneaux say earlier, most of his kids that he sees aren't hooked on drugs. They have other vulnerabilities that people are preying on. So for instance, this is from one of the law review articles that I actually read dealing with this, talking about kids for sale, where a minor refused to prosecute her pimp because he gets me a Subway sandwich whenever I want one. So again, it was as simple as that. Like, that's how basic her needs were, that she was not going to turn on her pimp. Need for love and family. We hear this all the time with our child victims, which is they're coming out of a situation that isn't so great, either foster care or juvenile detention or a bad home, and someone's telling them, I'll love you, I'll take care of you, you'll be a part of my family, you'll be a part of my home. But then what comes after that is, but you need to do this to kind of earn your keep in order to be a part of the family. Again, this is from a law review article. Sexually exploited teens are not motivated by lust or greed. That's not something that they're motivated by. They're motivated by love. They want someone to love them. Again, one of probably our most basic need, right? Here's a quote from a federal agent who was interviewed after he did a big bust dealing with quite a few child prostitutes. He said, he was talking about pimps, and he was saying, look, these guys are not the smartest guys in the world, but they are really good at manipulations. He said they're not overly smart, but they are master manipulators. They can identify the one thing in her life that she's missing and fill that void, and that's what they're good at. I know when I went to some conferences, and we would have sometimes ex-pimps who were now reformed and would come in and talk to us about what did they do, what was their life like. Some of them would say things like, I could look at a group of 5 or 6 girls and just from the look in their eyes see the one girl that was vulnerable, that I knew that I could kind of cherry pick and control. So again, that kind of manipulation is something especially for the child victims. So here's kind of some of my arguments for why it's completely ridiculous that we hold even 16 and 17-year-olds accountable for prostitution in this state as well as most of the other states. First of all, as most people will agree, sex for money is a contract. That's forming a contract. It's a commercial, we all agree it's a commercial sex act. Minors under 18 aren't permitted to contract generally. There's all these laws that say they're not, and there's a lot of reasons for that, right? First of all, it's a protective measure that kids aren't ready for that yet. They don't have the maturity to engage in contracts, and they don't have the capability to negotiate a fair exchange. They just don't have that in any type of exchange. That's why they're not going and buying cars or doing things like that as well. That's not something that they're able to do. One kind of area that comes up all the time, aside from the contractual issue, is, as I said, the statutory rape issue, which is, okay, what's your age of consent? So here in Ohio, it's 16. So we are habitually dealing with 16 and 17-year-olds being charged with prostitution because the argument, generally from men, sorry, but is that well, if a 16-year-old can consent to having sex, why can't she consent to being a prostitute? It's the same thing. So first, I think it's a little difficult if you haven't worked in the field to understand that it is quite different from both an emotional, psychological, mental standpoint, that it's not the same thing. So I kind of try to put this in some way that maybe I could explain at least my reasoning, which is, a 16-year-old girl who's dating her boyfriend and likes him and decides we're going to have sex, and maybe he's 16 or 17-year-old, is a very different decision than a 16-year-old girl who's alone, scared, hungry, whatever else, and feels that she has to have sex with multiple older men every day that she doesn't like. This is not, she doesn't want to have sex with them, but she's making the decision to have sex with them, or else she could be getting beaten up, or else she has no food or no place to sleep. So to say that the one decision is at all similar to the other, I think is insulting to trafficking victims. But aside from that, it still comes up in a lot of cases. In Ray BW, this is unfortunately one of the few reported cases dealing with whether or not you can enforce prostitution charges against children. And in this case, this was the Texas Supreme Court case where the court said, really focused on the fact that they had a very young child there. I think she was 14. And they said, look, if you're below the age of consent, you can't be guilty of prostitution offense. So again, this is very helpful for cases that deal with very young kids. It's not helpful for cases like what we generally see in Ohio. And I know for here in Cuyahoga County, generally McGinty's stance is, if she's 16 or 17, I'll charge her. If she's below that, I'm not going to charge her. So again, age of consent, a 16 or 17-year-old cannot do things like go to a strip club, I don't know how that happened, go to a bar, drink alcohol, buy cigarettes, but yet she or he can be prosecuted for a prostitution offense. So again, it's just seems to be somewhat of a rational disconnect with respect to what message we are sending to these children, when to a certain extent we are saying, you are not capable of making the rational decision to walk into a strip club or to walk into a bar or to drink alcohol. You're not capable of making that decision, so we are going to say, no, you can't do that. But we are saying that they're capable of selling their body for sex, generally out of desperation. I mean, every study says that's why they're doing it. We're saying that they're capable of doing it and then being prosecuted for it. So again, that seems like a real disconnect. Ancillary issues. This case really bothered me, so I had to put up 5 slides about it because I can't help it, it really bothered me. So California has actually really come a long way compared to most courts at saying, look, if it's related to human trafficking, if this child was at all, if there's any issue that this child was trafficked, then we're not gonna prosecute this child. And this was a 17-year-old girl. So I pulled up this case from California, and at least I was really disturbed by it. She was convicted for soliciting prostitution. The court here, this was actually an evidence issue of whether or not the court should admit evidence of her commercial sex act. What ended up happening was she approached an undercover cop, and the undercover cop brought her in, and the charges were pressed, and she was convicted. So the trafficking, the way that their laws are written is that the trafficking statute says, look, if you're a victim, then you can't include that evidence. That's automatically excluded. So it's like an evidentiary issue. So this young woman was raped by her father at 3, introduced to her first pimp, whose name was Williams, at 14. He forced her to have sex with him and his uncle until she ran away. She had an abortion at 15 out of that interaction. She then was introduced to her next pimp, Jigga, at 16. He hit her in the face with his fist if she didn't make enough money. She said she was afraid each time she ran away from a pimp, explaining, because I am theirs, I am their property. So for me to run away from them is not good. She ended up having a total of 10 pimps between the time of 14 and 17. At the time she ended up approaching the undercover cop, though, she didn't have a pimp. She had finally gone home. And she approached the car and she said to herself, "Don't go to the car. Don't do it. You're better than this." But she needed money. The court ruled she's guilty of soliciting prostitution because the court said, quote, "She did not solicit prostitution in this instance as a result of being a victim of human trafficking." And the court actually referred to her as an independent contractor, referred to a 17-year-old as an independent contractor. So again, maybe I'm, too much of a bleeding heart here, but the fact that that even California, who has moved so forward on this, says that this is not a result of her being a trafficking victim with the history that she's had, because in this particular instance, there wasn't a pimp forcing her to go approach the car, shows that even when we make some real breakthroughs in the legislation, you still have real issues with how the courts are going to interpret it. And sometimes, unfortunately, there's still kind of that stigma attached to prostitution, even for children, that makes them not want to, unfortunately, interpret it too broadly. So the next big issue that I wanted to touch on, especially because this is really a hot issue right now, is going after the advertisers, especially the internet advertisers, because as you know, that's really where a lot of this has moved into, especially with respect to minors. I don't know why it keeps doing that. So in the last 5 years, we've seen an 846% increase in reports of suspected child sex trafficking, and that has been directly correlated to the increased use of internet to sell children for sex. So again, most of the studies say that it's really attributable to, it's very highly profitable to use the internet, and it's really low risk. So compared to the street type prostitution or the other types of prostitution where you're advertising people other ways, it's much easier. I'm going to primarily focus on Backpage, since Backpage covers about 70% of the advertising of children and adults in the sex industry. Backpage, 80% of all of its revenue is from online commercial advertising. So I know that Brian mentioned earlier that you can get a lawnmower, you can get, other things on Backpage, but 80% of the time people are getting sex on Backpage. That's what they're getting. So are there children on Backpage? I don't know, you tell me. She looks like a child to me. She looks pretty young. So I think it's pretty easy to jump on Backpage any minute of any day and find lots of young children on Backpage. Here she's saying, "I never kiss and tell," and she says she's 23. They will never say, there's all these coding on Backpage. They will never say, "I'm 15 or 14, but there's a lot of coding that folks in the know, which I'm not one of them, but folks in the know how to find if it isn't obvious enough that this girl is not 23. I mean, maybe I'm blind, but she's clearly not 23. Okay, so, and how do even survivors feel about it? A lot of survivors now are taking, and as I'm going to get to near the end, the government is taking Backpage to task. So this is from a New York Times article where a survivor said, "Look, I'm out of the life now. I blame the pimps, I blame the Johns," but she said she blames the internet and Backpage more than anyone, because I was a kid and Backpage was advertising me over and over again. And she said, "You can't buy a child at Walmart, can you? But you can go on Backpage and you can buy me on Backpage." And that's how she felt when she was in the life. So what has this kind of spurred? It spurred a lot of lawsuits against Backpage. There's been lawsuits in Massachusetts, Michigan, Oregon, San Francisco. Most of them at this point have been dismissed, basically on the premise that there's no affirmative participation. Backpage always argues that first, of course, it claims First Amendment defenses, but also argues that, look, we don't have any affirmative participation in the web content. We just provide the space. We don't actually get involved in the content. So you can't hold us liable for this. So that's generally their claim. So here the court said, look, we're not sympathetic, but unless there's an affirmative participation, we're going to have to dismiss. Geez, this thing really wants to jump ahead. Until last September, the Washington Supreme Court ruled against Backpage and allowed a suit to proceed against Backpage. This was a case, JS v. Backpage, that involved 3 girls. They were forced into prostitution, of course, advertised on Backpage. They spanned the 7th and 9th grade. These girls were, of course, very young. The court said, look, the key question is, did Backpage design its posting rules so that it induced sex trafficking? And the court said, look, if the website helps develop illegal content, then it falls under the exception in federal law. You have like the Communications Decency Act that generally provides an exception that allows Backpage to get out from under these lawsuits. So the court said, look, that's the question that they should go ahead and go to trial and let the trial court decide. Backpage also is on the offensive sometimes. In Cook County, the Cook County Sheriff called on credit cards to cease making online payments to Backpage's adult escort services. So again, about 80% of its profits. And the credit cards said, okay, in Cook County. They went along with that. Backpage sued, saying that the county sheriff is violating their free speech rights, Backpage's free speech rights. So that is pending. So that leads to another question, though, that Brian brought up earlier, which is the flip side of Backpage is, do we really want it to go away, though? Because it's the #1 investigative tool for investigators, right, for police. And this one hits really close to home. This is from Bedford Municipal Court, which is, if I get a speeding ticket, I would have been in front of this guy, but luckily I didn't. So you probably remember this was just last year, where he was guilty of soliciting prostitutes, Harry Jacobs. He was soliciting massages with a JJ on Backpage for $200 an hour. He then met another prostitute and solicited both of them for 3-way encounters. He bought the women lingerie and wine. He was convicted of 3 counts of soliciting prostitutes, spent 60 days in jail, 6 months on house arrest, and 2 years probation. And the way that they found all this was through Backpage, through his postings on Backpage.
What's the disciplinary counsel doing with him?
What?
What's the Supreme Court doing with him?
I don't know. I think, yeah.
He was kind of barred.
Yeah, I'm sure he's.
What were the ages of the?
These were not girls, but I was just putting it up just because it's so close to home. These were adults. Here's another example. Now the rest of them are going to be girls. This is Christopher Bryant, who was online. He controlled and prostituted 3 girls ages 16 to 17. They found them because one of the girls' sisters saw her on an online prostitution site, and he was bragging on his Facebook page. You find a lot of pimps bragging on Facebook pages, believe it or not. This was Pimping 101, and this was just the beginning for him. So he ended up getting arrested that way. People v. Brown in California. Brown boasted about being a smart pimp. And I'm not going to read this because it's just gross, but here's his quote about how to handle your hoes. And he ended up being subject to a police sting. So they did text messages and phone calls, and the cop posed as, I think, a 17-year-old girl. He instructed her on how to get green dot money so he could post her profile on Backpage. I mean, these guys are so sleazy, like they don't put out any of their own money. They make the girl put out the money. They make the girl rent the hotel room. Like nothing's under their own name or their own money. And then he showed up at the hotel to collect his money and was busted. Here's another one, Eric McMillan. On parole for pimping at the time, and he bragged about his pimping abilities to get a 17-year-old girl to prostitute for him. Turned out to be an undercover cop. He received a 7-year jail sentence as a result of that. So finally, the government versus the back page. And this also hits close to home because it's Senator Porter, really, that is at the head of this, who is from Ohio, who is one of our Ohio senators. The U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Investigations, that is chaired by Senator Porter, is investigating sex trafficking on the internet. And this is clearly going on right now. And they have, according to their investigations, said that Backpage is, quote, the leading forum for unlawful sexual commerce on the internet. They issued a subpoena to Backpage requesting some information. Specifically, they found from their investigation that Backpage edits the contents of their ads in order to remove evidence of illegality of the underlying transaction. So that was a real issue that came up. They also said that it looks like Backpage is hiding data. So in other words, not retaining some of that metadata that they're supposed to retain associated with images posted on the site. So when Brian talked earlier about I'll issue a subpoena and then get information from them on a more global scale for this type of investigation, when they're asking for all of your data and statistics, they were getting information relating to the fact that we're not getting true data from Backpage. We're not really getting the statistics from Backpage. So they asked for, they issued a subpoena trying to get that. And they issued a subpoena to the CEO, Carl Ferrer. He ignored the subpoena and failed to appear. So as you see, that's the little empty chair behind his name. The Senate panel voted unanimously to initiate civil contempt proceedings against Backpage, which for those of you, again, who are lawyers, know that's pretty unusual. This is going to be the first time in more than 20 years, if the Senate goes along with that vote, that this has ever happened, that there's actually going to be civil contempt proceedings against a corporation. Senator McCaskill, Clara McCaskill, who is the co-chair with Senator Porter, she used to do investigations into this area. She was an investigator. She gave a lot of interviews talking about how horrifying this was. And she said, this is really the height of arrogance. We are not on a fishing expedition. Today on Backpage, children are being trafficked for sex. I'm disgusted that any company wouldn't participate and cooperate with any investigation into the trafficking of children. And finally, she said, if Backpage thinks they are going to go quietly into the night, they are sadly mistaken. So that is all I have on that. Any questions? We have a few minutes.
Have you been able to propose legislation to change the soliciting statute itself to make, as opposed to fighting it in a court of law where the statute doesn't have it, make it in the statute, put an age, 16, 18, whatever the age is?
Okay, so I don't know if this is on. Okay, so the issue with, I just got appointed to the subcommittee in the last couple months, but the issue, as I understand, with trying to even put forward the trafficking statutes, the prostitution statute has stayed the same, like as far as just what, charging someone with prostitution, that hasn't changed. So if your question is changing the prostitution statute, no one has asked to change that. So that's a good, but I'll answer that by answering another question, which is by trying to put forward some of the trafficking statute. Like I told you, if we had even changed our trafficking statute so it was in alliance with the federal statute, in other words, saying if defining trafficking to say that it's coercion, fraud, coercion, or if the victim is under 18. If we defined it that way, then really automatically, if you're a victim under Ohio law, you can't be a criminal under Ohio law as well, right? But we couldn't do that when you can't be, right? Like, so that's because that's what federal law does. Federal law really just did the trafficking statute. They didn't, I mean, they don't have prostitution laws under federal law anyway, but because it's a state crime. But so that's what they did. The reason that they weren't even able to do that is because there were a couple male legislators who said, no, that's ridiculous. The statutory consent here in Ohio is 16. So if a girl can consent to sex at 16, she can be prosecuted for prostitution at 16. So there were at least a couple holdouts that we will have to keep working on or vote out of office in order to get that changed. So absolutely, that needs to change, but that was I was not part of those discussions because I wasn't even on the committee at that point.
I can speak loud.
They don't hear up there.
Hang on one second.
Yeah, you have to. Yeah.
So, Maureen, I'm not an attorney, and I know that everybody has the right to be represented. Are there any changes in the ethics rulings now for attorneys to shy away from defending these Johns and pimps? I know it's kind of a stupid question, but
Yeah.
I mean, is it just money that pulls attorneys to defend these people? I don't get it. I mean, isn't there a moral thing? There's not, huh?
No, we take it
Wow.
to-
Well, yeah, I mean, I think every lawyer in here kind of grumbled because we all believe just as strongly as we believe in everything else we're talking here that everyone is entitled to a defense. That's a part of our oath that we take. So everyone is entitled to a defense. That being said, like for Johns, I don't think that's been a big issue because up until now, it's always just been a slap on the wrist misdemeanor. So it's not like I don't think they're going out and getting high-priced attorneys as Johns. Now it's going to start being an issue if they're getting pulled in under these. I'm not aware of any big arrests that have been made under the new statutes of Johns being arrested for soliciting 14 or 15-year-olds, but if they are going to need a high-priced lawyer to represent them for that. As far as traffickers go, I certainly, as an attorney, you have the right to turn down a case unless it's been assigned to you, unless you're on the assignment list. But generally, I don't know that they're all getting super high-priced, fancy attorneys anyway, because as we talked about, a lot of them, they blow their assets on bling and everything anyway, so they're not coming in with a ton of money unless they're one of those few that are very organized.
Thank you. Maureen, I have a question. I'm not an attorney either, so how is it even legal to advertise? I mean, I'm pretty sure you can't advertise on a billboard to sell somebody for sex. How are you allowed to do it on Backpage?
Okay, so I'm trying to find where. How far back was that? I'm trying to show you. I want to show you that. Here it is. So notice that they're pretty careful about what they say. There's not ever the words like I went to one that I'm not going to get really specific with you, but they will never come out and say sex. I'm going to have sex with you. They will never come out and say like the specific acts that they will. There's always there's acronyms for things. There's a lot of initials used for things.
So it's all in the wording. We all know what it is, but it's all in the wording, and that's what makes it okay.
Someone would say, I'm not advertising sex. Maybe she's saying she's going to kiss you, but are you kidding? And also, she's not underage. She's saying she's 23.
And then one other thing. It's been brought up before at other presentations that I've heard. If you shut down Backpage, the pimps and traffickers will find another spot to go to, and then it's more difficult then to proceed in finding something where they're going next.
I agree. I completely agree with what Brian said earlier, which is I think it's a double-edged sword. I think that I went to one presentation where just on Facebook alone, because Facebook has been attacked too, especially for underage hits, there was an FBI agent who put in something really innocuous, like I think it was just selfies, which I think is innocuous. I guess I shouldn't think that, but I did at the time. And it was horrifying how many hits he had for underage kids coming up. like pornography underage kids. And the organizations have gone to Facebook and said, take this off. And Facebook kind of raised the whole First Amendment thing, which there's no First Amendment for, again, those of you who are lawyers, there's no First Amendment rights for child porn because that's illegal. So you don't have First Amendment rights protecting child porn. But that being said, I thought at the same time, it's also a double-edged sword because you can use, and we've seen with Facebook too, investigators have used Facebook to find criminal enterprises and to find criminals. So I don't have an easy answer to that. I really don't. I agree with you. I think that and most investigators will now tell you that the internet is the chief investigative tool that they use. However, here, when Backpage is not cooperating in investigations, I have a problem with that. I think that they should be taken to task for that. When they're making that much money off the backs of young children that are being advertised, I have a problem with that.
Okay. This particular child may be an American citizen, but I doubt it roundly. My recollection is that about 15 years ago, Congress passed a special visa for victims of this kind of trafficking. So, while that isn't the main purview of today's practitioners would do well to remember there may be immigration benefits to accrue to a child like this.
Yeah, so generally the standard is fairly low, that the child needs a certain, especially for children, they have much more rights with respect to immigration than adults as human trafficking survivors. So the standard is pretty low, that they need protection and that they don't have other available amenities available to them. So usually that they don't, in other words, that they can't really go home right now. So it's a pretty low standard. So absolutely, assuming that you can find this girl and provide, and she wants those opportunities. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and take a quick break, and then we'll come back together in about 10 minutes for our last presentation.